In recent developments surrounding the judicial system and its intersection with powerful institutions, there has been an intense and increasingly vocal campaign aimed at scrutinizing and challenging the authority of certain members of the federal judiciary. At the center of this effort is a growing call to initiate impeachment proceedings against judges deemed to have strayed from their intended role as impartial arbiters of the law. This call is not being made lightly, nor is it coming from obscure or fringe figures. It is being amplified by influential voices who believe that some judges are acting not within the confines of the Constitution, but rather as political activists wielding the bench for ideological objectives. The argument fueling these impeachment calls is rooted in the belief that some judicial figures are no longer simply interpreting the law, but are instead crafting policies from the bench that directly contradict legislative intent or popular mandate. This viewpoint hinges on the idea that certain rulings have overstepped judicial boundaries and effectively obstructed administrative reforms that were enacted in accordance with statutory authority. Those championing this stance assert that judicial independence, while foundational to democracy, must not equate to unaccountable power, especially when such power is exercised to override the will of elected bodies or the electorate. Critics of the judiciary in this context point to decisions that have blocked the restructuring or elimination of specific government agencies, even after comprehensive executive reviews and legally mandated procedures. These decisions are portrayed as arbitrary or ideologically motivated rather than based on clear constitutional reasoning. In this narrative, judges who issue such rulings are accused of using their positions to protect entrenched bureaucracies, acting less like neutral interpreters and more like defenders of a political status quo. Underlying these accusations is a broader frustration with what is perceived as an increasingly opaque and insulated judicial class. Federal judges, appointed for life and largely shielded from public scrutiny, are often seen as immune to the consequences of their decisions. This disconnect, according to critics, creates an environment where ideological rulings can be issued without fear of reprisal or reversal, especially when higher courts are similarly aligned or reluctant to intervene. As a result, the call for impeachment is framed not merely as a political maneuver, but as a constitutional remedy. Advocates argue that impeachment is a legitimate check on judicial power, designed to protect the balance of the three branches of government. They emphasize that while the bar for impeachment must remain high, it should not be so unattainable, that judges are effectively beyond any form of accountability. Historical precedent is often cited where judges have been impeached for abuses of power, corruption, or overt partisanship, even if such cases have been rare. The movement also draws attention to the lack of transparency in the judiciary's decision-making process. Critics claim that rulings with far-reaching consequences are sometimes made behind closed doors without adequate public explanation or input. This is viewed as especially problematic in cases involving executive actions that aim to streamline or reform federal operations. In these instances, judicial obstruction is cast not just as a legal disagreement, but as an active hindrance to progress and reform. Those leading this campaign have gone a step further by aligning with political actors willing to take legislative action. There has been a visible push to support lawmakers who pledge to investigate and potentially pursue impeachment hearings. Campaign donations, public endorsements, and social media advocacy have all been mobilized to boost the profiles of representatives who share these goals. The strategy appears to be twofold: to place pressure on the judiciary by threatening political consequences, and to signal to the public that the courts are not above democratic oversight. This approach, however, is not without controversy. Legal scholars and traditionalists warn that targeting judges for impeachment based on unpopular or controversial decisions sets a dangerous precedent. They caution that such efforts could undermine judicial independence, eroding public confidence. In a system that relies on judges being free from political pressure, yet proponents of impeachment insist that their concerns are not about policy differences, but about a pattern of judicial behavior that they believe betrays the responsibilities of the office. What further fuels the intensity of this issue is the perception that certain judges consistently rule in ways that align with one political ideology, regardless of the legal arguments presented. When judicial decisions appear predictably partisan, it feeds into the argument that some judges, are less interested in legal interpretation and more invested in achieving political outcomes. This pattern, once identified, becomes a rallying point for those who believe that impeachment is not just appropriate, but necessary to restore balance. Beyond the legal community, this debate has sparked significant public engagement. The idea that judges could be impeached for what are seen as activist decisions has captured the imagination of those frustrated with government inertia or obstruction. Social media campaigns, think pieces, and public forums have all contributed to a growing awareness and polarization on the issue. For some, it's a wake-up call that the judiciary must be held accountable. For others, it's an alarming step toward politicizing the courts. As the conversation continues, it is clear that the boundaries of judicial power and the mechanisms available to check that power are being tested. What was once a largely theoretical debate about judicial activism has become a live issue with tangible political consequences. The judiciary, long seen as the least dangerous branch, is now at the center of a storm that could reshape its role in American governance for years to come. A defining moment in the ongoing confrontation between branches of government has emerged through the deliberate defiance of a federal court order concerning the dissolution of a prominent government agency. This episode has sparked a wide-ranging debate about the rule of law, executive power, and the integrity of judicial authority in the United States. At its core, the situation highlights a brazen challenge to the legitimacy of federal court rulings and has raised fundamental questions about whether judicial decisions are enforceable if those subject to them refuse to comply. The issue centers around the attempted dismantling of a key international development agency that has operated for decades under the banner of humanitarian aid and global diplomacy. Citing inefficiency and concerns about mission drift, the executive branch initiated a swift and controversial plan to shut down the agency entirely. This move, while supported by certain political factions and elements of the public, was met with fierce legal opposition. Advocacy groups, former diplomats, and public accountability watchdogs argued that the closure lacked proper procedural grounding and bypassed statutory protections meant to prevent abrupt termination of such institutions. In response, a federal judge issued a court order mandating an immediate halt to the shutdown efforts. The judge emphasized that the agency's operations could not be legally suspended without following a detailed and transparent review process as outlined by administrative law. This ruling was designed to serve as a temporary safeguard, while the broader legal challenges made their way through the courts. It was a classic use of judicial authority, a check placed on the executive branch to ensure adherence to legal norms and processes. However, instead of compliance, the order was openly defied. Within days of the court's ruling, reports emerged that staff were being dismissed, budgets frozen, programs discontinued, and offices shuttered. The machinery of dissolution continued unabated, even as the injunction remained in place. For legal scholars and institutional analysts, this represented not merely a breach of decorum, but a direct affront to the judiciary itself. When a court order is ignored by those it is meant to bind, the broader implications reverberate far beyond the specific case. This act of defiance touched off an avalanche of concern from across the political and legal spectrum. Critics argued that such behavior erodes the foundation of checks and balances enshrined in the Constitution. The federal judiciary, lacking its own enforcement arm, relies on respect for its decisions from other branches of government. When that respect is withdrawn or disregarded, the balance of power tilts dangerously in favor of executive discretion. The very idea that a court ruling could be flouted with impunity raises the specter of authoritarianism, where legal orders become optional and accountability becomes elusive. Moreover, the continued dismantling of the agency was viewed not as a bureaucratic oversight or a miscommunication, but as a calculated move to demonstrate the limits of judicial reach. It sent a message that rulings perceived as inconvenient or politically motivated could be rendered irrelevant through sheer force of will and action. This approach, though praised in some circles as an example of bold leadership, was condemned by many as reckless, destabilizing, and corrosive to democratic norms. Legal experts highlighted the troubling precedent such actions could set. If one agency could be dismantled in spite of an injunction, what would prevent similar behavior in other areas of governance? Could environmental regulations be reversed, despite court opposition? Could civil rights protections be bypassed if they were deemed inefficient or politically inconvenient? The underlying concern was not simply about the fate of a single agency, but about the erosion of a system that depends on mutual adherence to lawful constraints. Adding to the controversy was the absence of any clear consequence for the violation of the court order. While the judge expressed displeasure and signaled that contempt proceedings could follow, no immediate punitive measures were enforced. This further emboldened those who viewed the judiciary as a paper tiger, an institution whose declarations could be ignored without real cost. In legal circles, the debate quickly shifted from the technicalities of administrative law to existential questions about judicial enforceability and the real-world power of legal rulings. The international community also took note. The agency at the center of the storm had long been seen as a symbol of soft power and global cooperation. Its abrupt and extra-legal dismantling sent a signal to foreign governments, NGOs, and multilateral institutions that the U.S. was willing to bypass its own internal checks for the sake of expediency. Allies expressed concern over the reliability of American commitments, while critics seized the moment to portray the country as turning inward and discarding rule-based governance. Inside the country, the episode galvanized opposition movements, including public interest lawyers, civil rights organizations, and members of the judiciary. Petitions were filed, emergency motions submitted, and media campaigns launched to raise awareness of what was framed as a constitutional crisis in slow motion. There was a recognition that this was not merely a matter of administrative disagreement, but a contest over the supremacy of law itself. Some members of Congress also responded by initiating inquiries and calling for oversight hearings. They sought testimony from those involved in the dismantling effort, demanded documentation, and raised the possibility of legislative responses. However, these efforts faced resistance and delay, further compounding fears that normal avenues of accountability were being systematically obstructed. In many ways, this episode became emblematic of a broader tension that had been building for years. The conflict between a judiciary tasked with upholding legal norms and an executive apparatus, increasingly willing to test the boundaries of power. While past administrations had certainly clashed with the courts, this level of direct confrontation, marked by open defiance, was unprecedented in its scope and visibility. What was once theoretical concern about the breakdown of institutional norms had now become tangible. The rule of law, often invoked as a cornerstone of democratic society, appeared vulnerable when not backed by collective will and enforcement mechanisms. The assumption that judicial decisions would always be respected, if not agreed with, no longer held. A new reality was being tested in real time, one in which the effectiveness of the courts depended less on their authority and more on their ability to compel compliance in a deeply polarized environment. In recent political developments, the use of financial support as a tool to influence the judicial landscape has taken on new significance. A growing number of high-profile figures and donors are strategically channeling resources toward lawmakers who share their views on judicial reform, particularly in regard to holding judges accountable for what they perceive as politically motivated decisions. These efforts have moved beyond typical campaign contributions and now represent a deliberate, calculated attempt to reshape the judiciary through legislative action, starting with the people who hold the power to initiate and pursue impeachment proceedings. At the heart of this strategy is the belief that certain judges have overstepped their constitutional boundaries, rendering decisions not on the basis of law, but according to personal ideology or political alignment. Those advocating for change argue that the judicial branch, long protected by lifetime appointments and shielded from public accountability, has become detached from the democratic principles it was meant to uphold. In their view, judges who consistently rule in ways that frustrate reform efforts or block administrative actions are no longer simply interpreting the law, they are obstructing progress. This has fueled a growing movement to hold these judges accountable through the only constitutional mechanism available, impeachment. But impeachment, while legally permissible, is politically difficult. It requires significant public support and, more importantly, a willingness among legislators to begin the process. To overcome this hurdle, political donors have begun investing heavily in lawmakers who are open to challenging the judiciary's immunity from consequence. These contributions are not scattered or incidental. They are part of a focused campaign. The strategy involves identifying representatives and senators who have expressed frustration with the courts and encouraging them to be more vocal and active on the issue. In return, these lawmakers receive financial backing that enables them to amplify their message, run aggressive campaigns, and gain the influence needed to push forward with investigations or hearings related to judicial overreach. The implications of this approach are profound. It signals a shift in how political capital is used, not merely to advance traditional legislative goals, but to directly influence the balance of power between branches of government. Those providing the financial support argue that this is a necessary correction, a way to reassert democratic accountability in a system where judges can make sweeping decisions without facing any personal or professional risk. The lawmakers benefiting from this support have already begun to act. Some have introduced resolutions demanding inquiries into specific judicial decisions. Others have proposed legislation aimed at increasing transparency in the judiciary, including measures that would require judges to disclose communications, financial interests, or ideological affiliations. Still others have used public hearings to highlight what they describe as a pattern of judicial activism that undermines elected authority. Political advertisements and public messaging campaigns have also been funded to generate popular support for these efforts. These campaigns typically focus on the idea that the judiciary has become a barrier to reform, blocking efforts to streamline government, protect national interests, or respond to the will of the people. They often cite high-profile cases where court rulings have halted or delayed executive action, framing these decisions as unjustifiable and politically charged. Supporters of this movement view financial backing as a legitimate form of democratic participation. They argue that if money is speech, as the Supreme Court has affirmed, then using campaign donations to support judicial accountability is both legal and necessary. In their eyes, it's not about undermining the courts, but about making sure judges are held to the same standards of responsibility as elected officials. On the other side of the debate, critics express grave concerns. Legal scholars, ethics watchdogs, and judicial advocates warn that targeting judges through political pressure, particularly when backed by large financial contributions, risks turning the judiciary into a partisan battleground. They fear a future where judicial decisions are swayed not by law or precedent, but by the threat of retaliation from powerful political donors or legislators seeking favor with them. These critics argue that judicial independence is a cornerstone of a functioning democracy. They point out that the judiciary was designed to be insulated from the passions of the moment, allowing judges to rule fairly even when their decisions are unpopular. They worry that if judges begin to fear for their careers whenever they issue a controversial ruling, the entire system could devolve into one where legal reasoning is replaced with political calculation. Nevertheless, the momentum behind this financial strategy continues to build. Political donors are increasingly selective in where they place their contributions, prioritizing candidates who support aggressive oversight of the judiciary. In some races, the issue of judicial accountability has even become a central theme, with candidates promising voters that they will push back against what they call an unaccountable legal elite. Beyond campaign finance, donors are also funding think tanks, advocacy groups, and media platforms that promote the same agenda. These organizations publish reports, hold events, and distribute materials that highlight perceived judicial failures and call for reform. They work to influence public opinion, provide talking points for sympathetic lawmakers, and pressure political parties to adopt their positions. This layered approach, combining direct donations with broader advocacy, reflects a sophisticated understanding of how influence is exerted in modern politics. It acknowledges that lasting change requires more than one election cycle or one law. It requires a shift in how the public views the judiciary and its role in governance. By investing in both the political and cultural dimensions of the debate, these donors are aiming for systemic transformation. Some observers believe this could represent a new era in American politics, one where the judiciary is no longer off limits to the same forces that shape Congress and the presidency. Whether this leads to greater accountability or lasting damage to the court system remains to be seen. What is clear, however, is that financial influence is being used in increasingly strategic ways to challenge the autonomy of the judiciary and force a reckoning with its perceived failures. Amid escalating tensions between the branches of government, a rare and pointed statement emerged from the highest-ranking judicial authority in the United States, addressing growing calls to remove federal judges from office for decisions deemed politically or ideologically unfavorable. The remarks came at a time when judicial rulings, particularly those halting or scrutinizing certain executive actions, had drawn public ire from influential figures who questioned not only the legitimacy of those decisions, but also the impartiality of the judges behind them. In an uncharacteristically direct message, the nation's chief legal figure offered a firm rebuttal to those who had begun advocating for the impeachment of federal judges based solely on controversial or unpopular rulings, emphasizing the importance of judicial independence. The statement clarified that while disagreement with court decisions is an inherent part of a functioning democracy, impeachment is not a remedy for dissatisfaction with a judge's interpretation of the law. The timing and tone of the statement were significant. Historically, those in such a role have refrained from commenting on politically charged matters, preferring instead to let the work of the judiciary speak for itself. However, the climate had shifted. Legal decisions were being portrayed as acts of sabotage against reform efforts. Judges were being accused, without substantial evidence, of wielding their authority in bad faith. In response to this rising rhetoric, the chief judicial authority stepped forward to defend the integrity of the courts and the constitutional structure that supports them. The statement underscored a key principle: that the judiciary is not meant to serve the interests of any political party or ideology, but to interpret the law based on established legal principles and constitutional mandates. In doing so, judges are bound to issue rulings that will at times conflict with the preferences of those in power. This dynamic, while often contentious, is not a sign of dysfunction. Rather, it is a sign that the system is working as intended. Furthermore, the remarks made it clear that impeachment, as outlined in the Constitution, is reserved for grave offenses such as treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Disagreeing with the reasoning of a court's decision, no matter how strongly one feels, does not meet this threshold. To redefine impeachment as a tool for settling legal disagreements would, the statement warned, set a dangerous precedent, one that threatens the separation of powers and risks turning the judiciary into a branch subservient to political whims. The AND statement also highlighted the importance of the appellate process, reminding the public and political leaders alike that the proper venue for addressing concerns with judicial rulings lies within the legal framework itself. Dissatisfaction with a court's interpretation should be pursued through appeals, motions for reconsideration, or even legislative clarification, where appropriate. It is through these mechanisms, not retaliation, that the legal system maintains its coherence and respectability. The implications of this message were far-reaching. It served not only as a defense of the individual judges under scrutiny, but as a reaffirmation of the judiciary's role in a constitutional democracy. By speaking out, the nation's top judicial officials signaled that the courts could not, and would not, be intimidated into compliance. The statement was, in essence, a declaration that the rule of law must prevail, even in the face of political pressure. Observers across the political spectrum responded in varied ways. Supporters of judicial independence praised the statement as a necessary intervention in an increasingly volatile political environment. They noted that silence in such moments could be misinterpreted as acquiescence, and that the message was crucial in reinforcing public trust in the judiciary. Others, however, remained critical, insisting that certain rulings reflected bias or overreach, and that stronger checks on judicial conduct were justified. Legal scholars weighed in to contextualize the situation historically. They pointed to the extremely limited number of federal judges who have ever been impeached, emphasizing that such proceedings have traditionally been reserved for clear violations of law or ethical standards. The fear now, they argued, was that political actors were seeking to normalize impeachment as a routine tool for penalizing judicial independence. If successful, this shift could have a chilling effect on judges, dissuading them from issuing bold or unpopular decisions, even when supported by the law. Public reaction varied widely depending on political affiliation, but many Americans who had not previously considered the details of judicial accountability found themselves drawn into the conversation. The statement served as an educational moment, highlighting how the judiciary functions and why its insulation from political backlash is not a flaw but a foundational safeguard. Discussions around dinner tables, in classrooms, and on social media reflected renewed interest in how judicial appointments, lifetime tenure, and the appellate process all work together to ensure impartiality. At the same time, some political leaders took the opportunity to either echo the statement's message or to distance themselves from the impeachment rhetoric altogether. While some had initially supported the idea of removing certain judges, others began to walk back their comments, citing the importance of focusing on long-term legal strategies rather than short-term political confrontations. For many, the statement provided a much-needed framework for recalibrating the debate. The situation also reinvigorated civic organizations and legal associations that advocate for judicial ethics and independence. These groups used the statement to rally support for initiatives aimed at educating the public about the courts and defending judges from political attacks. Petitions, op-eds, and forums sprang up across the country, reinforcing the idea that a healthy democracy requires a judiciary capable of standing apart from political battles. Internationally, the statement was seen as an affirmation of the values that have historically defined the American legal system. In many parts of the world where judicial independence is tenuous or under constant threat, the public reaffirmation of judicial integrity by a leading figure served as a reminder of what democratic resilience looks like. Legal observers from allied nations expressed cautious optimism that the United States, despite internal pressures, remained committed to the constitutional principles that have long guided its governance. In legal education settings, the moment became a case study in the balance of power. Professors used the statement to illustrate the role of the judiciary and the proper channels through which judicial conduct should be examined. Law students analyzed not only the legal implications, but the rhetorical strategies used to assert authority without inflaming tensions. For many, it was a vivid demonstration of how the judiciary can assert itself while maintaining its distance from partisan conflict. As the dust settled in the wake of the statement, it became clear that the message had reached its intended audience. Not only those calling for judicial removal, but also the broader public that might otherwise be unaware of the stakes involved. It served as both a warning and a guidepost, reminding all parties that constitutional democracy rests not merely on the will of the majority, but on the enduring strength of its institutions. In the wake of mounting tension between the judicial and political branches, recent events have unveiled a deeper reckoning within the American system of governance. The judiciary, once widely regarded as a neutral guardian of the Constitution, now finds itself at the center of a storm, a battleground where legal interpretation collides with political ambition. This moment reveals not just a clash of institutions, but a test of the nation's commitment to the principles that have long underpinned its democratic framework. The overt defiance of court orders, the strategic targeting of judges through political and financial channels, and the inflammatory calls for impeachment based on judicial rulings rather than misconduct all point to a dangerous drift. The rule of law, a pillar of any functioning democracy, depends not only on the clarity of legal statutes, but on a shared understanding that those laws apply equally to all, regardless of power, position, or political preference. When individuals in positions of influence begin treating court decisions as obstacles to be ignored or eliminated, the foundations of legal accountability begin to crack. However, the decisive response from the judiciary's highest authority serves as both a corrective and a reminder. It reasserts that courts are not tools of convenience, but institutions charged with upholding the law, even when it is unpopular or inconvenient. The law must remain a steady compass, not one twisted by pressure or public outcry. In taking a public stand, the judiciary has drawn a line in the sand. While decisions may be debated, even challenged through appropriate channels, they cannot be nullified by political will alone. This confrontation has galvanized national discourse, sparking renewed awareness of how fragile institutional integrity can be when tested by forceful personalities and partisan divides. It has also highlighted how essential it is to protect judicial independence, not for the sake of judges themselves, but for the stability of the republic. Courts that fear retaliation cannot rule freely, and a democracy without free courts is one step away from authoritarianism. Yet there is still room for optimism. Public engagement with the issue has grown, legal communities have spoken out, and voices across political lines have begun to recognize the long-term damage that short-term political wins can cause. The debate has elevated civic understanding, and may ultimately foster a deeper appreciation for the judiciary's role in preserving democratic order. In the end, this moment is not just about courtrooms and political chambers. It is about what kind of nation the United States chooses to be. One that respects its institutions and the rule of law, or one that sacrifices them at the altar of expediency. The path forward will require vigilance, courage, and above all, a recommitment to the constitutional ideals that have long served as the bedrock of American democracy.